They told you capitalism was ugly, yes. Exploitative, yes. Unequal, yes. But necessary.
That was the deal. Not a just deal, not a humane deal, a deal. You sell your hours, you sell your back, your attention, your nerves, your eyesight, your patience, your youth. They own the factory, the office, the software, the patent, the warehouse, the trucks, the building, the bank account, the board, the deed, the future. And in exchange, the system says, yes, this is harsh, yes, this is rigged, yes, this is humiliating in 1,000 petty ways. But capital still needs labor. That was the one redeeming fiction. The rich could dominate you, but they could not entirely do without you. They still needed workers. And because they still needed workers, workers had leverage. Not enough leverage. Not automatic leverage. But some. And now the people who own the future are trying to build a machine that keeps the profits, keeps the hierarchy, keeps the ownership, and slowly loses the need for the worker. That is the real AI story. Not whether the chatbot sounds clever, not whether the billionaire sounds visionary, not whether some grinning executive tells you the robot can now fold a t-shirt. The real story is whether capitalism has finally built the thing it always wanted. Production with less dependence on labor, profit with fewer obligations, power with thinner concessions. This is the 8-hour workday with Rex Haymarket, where every miracle of innovation somehow arrives with a redundancy notice and a shareholder presentation. And yes, before anyone writes in, I'm aware of the irony. This warning about AI was made with AI. Welcome to the century. The issue was never the machine itself. The issue is, and always has been, who owns it. Tonight, capitalism built a machine that doesn't need workers. Before we talk about AI, we need to talk about the bargain capitalism made with workers, not morally, functionally. Capitalism never promised dignity. It promised output. It promised growth. It promised that all this inequality, all this insecurity, all this chaos would be justified because the system was productive and because, crucially, the owners still needed the many. The factory owner needed machinists, the retailer needed clerks, the logistics firm needed drivers. The hospital needed technicians, aides, schedulers, janitors, nurses, administrators. The office needed analysts, assistants, sales staff, marketers, recruiters, junior lawyers, junior accountants, junior programmers, an entire ecology of people doing the daily, invisible work that made the machine run. And because labor was necessary, labor could threaten to withdraw itself. That is what gave us unions. That is what made strikes frightening. That is what forced capital, every so often, to compromise. The welfare state was not a gift basket. It was a pressure valve. You got labor law not because bosses found Jesus. You got concessions because workers were disruptive, numerous, necessary, and politically dangerous. The social contract was never we respect workers. It was we can't run this thing without them. That is why the 20th century looked the way it did. Capital exploited labor, yes, but it could not simply wish labor away. And once you understand that, you understand the scale of what AI threatens. Because AI does not need to create a robot apocalypse to change society. It only needs to weaken that old necessity enough. That is the phrase to hold in your head all through this video. Not total replacement, reduced necessity. Once workers are less necessary, they are less powerful. Once they are less powerful, the old bargain starts to crack. And once that bargain cracks, the politics holding the whole thing together start to wobble too. The stupid version of the AI debate is very simple. Will all jobs disappear? Will robots replace everyone? Will the machine take my job next Tuesday? That is not serious enough, because the real threat is subtler, colder, and probably more plausible. AI does not have to replace every worker to transform the relationship between capital and labor. It only has to make enough make workers more replaceable. It only has to thin out enough entry-level roles. It only has to automate enough routine coordination, drafting, analysis, support, clerical work to change who has leverage in the room. And actual economists are saying this now in language so blunt it barely needs translation. Automation can also be used unproductively to reduce worker bargaining power. That is economist language for something much uglier. The machine does not have to make society better to make workers weaker. Sometimes automation is productive in the social sense. Sometimes it really does let people do less drudgery. But sometimes it is about disciplining labor. Sometimes it is about making workers easier to threaten, easier to replace, easier to manage, easier to underpay. That is the thing all the TED Talk rubbish leaves out. Technology is not neutral in a system where ownership is not neutral. And the real-world signals are already there. Investors and economists are already warning that AI-linked job losses are appearing in the most exposed sectors. Firms are cutting staff while pouring money into AI. Hiring freezes are showing up in some divisions, while AI-linked units expand. That is the shape of the new order, not one giant dramatic collapse, 1,000 quieter degradations. Fewer ladders into the middle class, fewer junior roles where people learn the trade, more internal competition, flatter organizations. Harder bargaining, more pressure to do more with less. And who gets squeezed first? Usually not the executive class.
Usually not the asset-owning class. Usually not the people writing the press release. It is the people in routine, white-collar work.
So no, this is not just a science story. It is a labor market story, a class story, a leverage story. And once you see that, you can stop asking the childish question, is AI good or bad? And ask the adult one, who does AI make less necessary and who gets richer from that fact? Now, one of the ways you make this argument land is by showing that it is not just coming from radicals, skeptics, or left economists. The Federal Reserve is talking about this. That matters because the Fed is not exactly famous for anti-capitalist melodrama. Their institutional hobby is understatement. And even there, the language is getting severe. We appear to be approaching the most significant reorganization of work in generations. Job displacement may precede job creation. That is not hype. That is not theory, podcast theater. That is a warning from inside the command center. And when central bankers start sounding like labor historians, you know something serious is moving underneath the economy. A Fed governor is basically saying, this technology may reorganize work on a generational scale, the pain may come before the benefits, and the normal macroeconomic playbook may not be enough. So if you are a worker, what that should tell you is simple. The people in charge are already thinking about a labor market where disruption is structural, not temporary, where churn is not just a blip, but a redesign. Which means you should stop listening to the people selling this as nothing more than a friendly productivity upgrade. Some of the people building this technology are making the same argument, or close enough. Democracy is ultimately backstopped by the idea that the population as a whole is necessary for the operation of the economy. If that leverage goes away, then the implicit social contract of democracy may stop working. Read that again. That is not me talking. That is not Yanis Varoufakis, the Marxist economist. That is not a union organizer waving a leaflet in the rain. That is the head of one of the world's major AI companies saying the quiet part out loud. If ordinary people lose economic leverage, democracy itself gets shaky. There it is, the whole game. Democracy depends, in part, on ordinary people being economically necessary. Of course, this future is not being sold to you as a threat. It is being sold to you as utopia. They are not walking onto stages saying, "Good evening, everyone. We have developed a powerful new way to compress labor's bargaining power, centralize ownership, and move society toward deeper dependency on private infrastructure." No, they sell abundance, liberation, post-scarcity, the end of drudgery. Jensen Huang says AI will create jobs rather than cut them. Elon Musk talks in the language of abundance and a future where work becomes optional. And listen, abundance is not the lie is ownership. Because abundance under democratic control is one thing. Abundance under concentrated private ownership is something else entirely. Under democratic control, powerful automation could mean shorter work weeks, public luxury, stronger guarantees, less precarity, more life. Under concentrated private ownership, it means private models, private clouds, private chips, private robots, private toll booths on the future. So here is the line I want you to remember. They promise Star Trek. They mean company town with Wi-Fi. To understand why this matters, you also have to puncture one of Silicon Valley's favorite myths, the inventor king. The story goes like this. History is moved by singular men of genius. The heroic founder sees what others cannot. He invents the future. The rest of us are lucky to live in the world he builds. Lovely story. Very cinematic. Frequently incomplete. The real power of these men is often not best understood as lone invention. It is better understood as ownership, acquisition, scaling, infrastructure control, control over distribution, and control over the story. Silicon Valley tells the story as invention. The balance sheet often tells the story as acquisition. These men are less Thomas Edison than railroad baron with product demos. Now we get to the phrase that makes people either very excited or very cross. Techno-Feudalism. Profit drives capitalism. Rent drove feudalism. For our purposes, the term is useful because it names the feeling and the structure at the same time. When more power comes from owning the gate than employing the worker. When more money comes from charging access than organizing production. When daily life gets routed through platforms you do not own, algorithms you do not govern, an infrastructure you cannot realistically refuse, then techno-feudalism stops sounding like a metaphor and starts sounding like a warning flare. If all of this still feels abstract, let me bring it home in a way Americans should find uncomfortable. Larry Ellison bought 98% of Lanai, including the resorts, much of the housing, and commercial property. Pause there, boss or landlord or both. That is not a metaphor. That is not a flourish. That is a modern ownership structure with openly feudal logic. If your housing is entangled with your job, if local commerce bends around one man's assets, if practical life is organized around one billionaire's domain, then formal freedom and real dependency start to drift apart. And Kauai is not Lanai. It is important not to overstate that. But it shows the same gravitational pull. Extreme wealth buys land. Land becomes domain. Domain becomes private power. Local history becomes inconvenience. Access narrows. Sovereignty starts to take on a private accent. Lanai shows what happens when concentrated ownership turns a place into dependency. Kauai shows how billionaire-scale private control keeps expanding under the language of development, privacy, and visionary ambition. AI threatens to generalize that logic beyond land. Under the language of development, privacy, and visionary ambition, AI threatens to generalize that logic beyond land. Now, some people will hear all of this and say, wait, isn't the left supposed to like automation? Isn't freedom from drudgery the point? Yes, exactly. The problem was never the machine, the problem was always ownership. A democratic society could use AI and automation to reduce toil, shorten the work week, socialize gains, and guarantee the basics of life. That is the dream. Less bullshit labor, more freedom, more culture, more rest, more dignity. But under concentrated private ownership, automation does not first arrive as freedom. It arrives as a threat. It arrives as be more productive or be replaced. Accept flatter teams, accept fewer juniors, accept AI oversight, accept degraded bargaining power, accept that your boss now thinks half your job is automatable. Because if the answer to all of those ownership questions is the same tiny class of tech owners and financiers, then what you are looking at is not the emancipation of humanity, it is the modernization of lordship. Capitalism always exploited workers, but it also needed them. AI threatens to narrow that crack. They promise abundance. They mean hierarchy with better software. They promise Star Trek. They mean company town with Wi-Fi. The future question is no longer simply, can technology produce abundance? The future question is, who owns the abundance? Democratic abundance or techno-feudal dependence? I'm Rex Haymarket. This has been the 8-Hour Workday. Like, subscribe, and remember, whenever they tell you the future is for everyone, check the deed, check the cap table, and check who still has to clock in.